Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, welcome back, everyone, to the Saturday evening program. I'm going to begin with paying homage to the Buddha and the Triple Gem again. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. We all have some idea about where we come from. The place that we were born. Maybe we call it our hometown. But actually, that's something that we've been told by other people. That information. It really hit home for me a couple of years back when I was trying to obtain a new copy of my birth certificate for some document that I needed. And they said, the first time that I ever became aware, that there was a special disclaimer on my birth certificate because it hadn't been filed until 6 years after my birth. Some mistake at the hospital or some mistake at the government office. We don't know exactly what happened. I don't know. But it really brought home the teaching of Roshi, Harada Roshi, my root teacher in Japan, who used to say, yeah, you have been told this information about the place of your birth. But in a way, it's just a concept. You know, the physical event happened, but even the name of that place, the name of the town or the street or the number on a building, those are all like signposts in vast space. Concepts that we put on the way that we live our physical life in this world. And there's nothing wrong with it. But perhaps it's not quite as reliable as we might think. not as obvious. And interestingly, the Buddha gives a very similar instruction in the suttas. There's a really beautiful sutta that I have been studying of late, in which the Buddha says that truly our ancestral home is right here in this body and mind. He says our ancestral home is in the 4 foundations of mindfulness, Satipatthana. And there are various translations of this term, our ancestral domain, or our ancestral domain is, I think, how Bhikkhu Bodhi has translated it. Venerable Anelio likes to use home turf, a little more colloquial. Gil Fronsdale uses native land. Native land. Also bringing home, for me, that using that phrase, also bringing home the conceptual nature of how we think about land and territory, right? We're sitting here at Aloka Vihara on land that used to belong to the Nisanan tribe, a tribe that some people would say doesn't exist anymore. And yet, we recently came across some beautiful photos of people from the tribe. Very dignified, powerful presence. So we, excuse me, we came into this land ethically, the best way we knew how, but it has its history. It was called something completely different. So going back to the Buddha, he says that the Satipatthana is our ancestral domain. And for me, that has such a beautiful resonance. It has a sense of a sense of familiarity, a sense of intimacy. A sense of feeling at home. Right here with this body and mind. And yet it also evokes for me the way in which we can sort of just take that for granted. The place that is the most familiar can be the one that we really least see, least appreciate. Excuse me. When I was living in San Francisco and also working there, I remember that sometimes I would go and visit with my friends in the East Bay, and I would come back across the Bay Bridge and see the city from the bridge. The beautiful, shining city, the white caps on the bay and the blue water and the red bridge, Golden Gate Bridge, and the hills. And I would appreciate the city so much from out there. So it's a reminder to that sometimes we need to return to where we are, return to our ancestral domain, to the place that is most familiar, in order to really appreciate it, even though it's always been right here. And yet, what is it? What is it that keeps us from that, from actually dwelling mindfully in the four foundations? So the four foundations, many of you probably know, are mindfulness of body, mindfulness of feeling tone, Vedana, mindfulness of mind, and mindfulness of Dhammas, or principles. What is it that keeps us from dwelling in that place, abiding in that place, appreciating the profound and clear teachings that are being manifested right here in this body and mind? And the Buddha gives a very clear answer to that as well. In these two suttas, it's actually two suttas, 47, number 6, and 47, number 7 in the Samyutta Nikaya, the connected discourses. And he says very clearly that what typically gets in the way is looking for pleasant experience, chasing after pleasant experience, rejecting unpleasant experience, ignoring neutral experience, right? So he says, but in particular, the chasing after the pleasant experiences. And he refers to this also as the first of the 5 hindrances, or the states of mind that obscure our awakening to clarity. Sense desire. And part of the lesson here is that, of course, this constant pursuit of the pleasant is, for one, impossible to fulfill, but for two, often a very frustrating endeavor. We can't get what we want all the time. And when we do get it, we often find that it hasn't resolved the underlying problem, really. So that's fundamental to the Buddha's teaching, right? This kind of chasing after the pleasant all the time, being a kind of driver of a life that doesn't become fully awake to the truth. Whole lifetimes can be spent that way, frittered away, really. But I would suggest that underlying that teaching, there's another subtle and yet very critical teaching from the Buddha. And it has to do with wise attention. It has to do with yoniso manasikara. And the metaphor that I want to use is about Sir Isaac Newton. So I don't know his life story very well, but I do know that legend has it that he became interested in studying gravity, the way that gravity works, by seeing the apple fall from the tree. And I thought, oh, that's really very interesting, right? So thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, maybe millions of people had seen apples fall from trees before. But they were more interested in the apples than in the gravity. But he shifted his attention, he shifted his perspective to look not at the object itself, but at the mechanism that was at work there, at the principle. And this is why the constant pursuit of pleasant experience is problematic. Because it is a constant reaching out toward objects without really being aware of the principle that underlies that. And how that affects the mind. So we could be like a scientist and we could begin to apply mindfulness to our experience. And discover something about the principles that are at work there. And we do that by returning to our ancestral domain. We do that by returning to our native land, to this place right here of body and mind. And the Satipatthana is a very comprehensive teaching. There are many, many different practices that are described in the Satipatthana. And really, any one of those could be a very interesting journey. But together, they are presenting a very clear journey, inward journey to full liberation. That is the point. full liberation from the delusion that somehow pleasant sense experiences are going to resolve our fundamental angst, our fundamental dissatisfaction. So the Buddha starts us off in the Satipatthana with a definition, what's called the definition, and he talks about the kinds of qualities that we bring to the study of body and mind that turn it into a skillful, wholesome path to awakening. And the first of those is diligence, or I like to think of it actually as being devoted. The Pali word is atapi. Sometimes it's translated as ardent, or it kind of it has a sense of very strong energy. But I like this idea of devoting ourselves to mindfulness, of devoting ourselves to our native land, to really becoming more deeply familiar and intimate with this domain right here. And he also speaks about clear knowing, sampajana. Clearly knowing. So it's actually a compound of knowing and then this some, which is kind of an emphasis. So it could be also translated as knowing well. What is it to know well? These four aspects of our experience. And then sati, mindfulness. Goodness knows many, many things have been said about mindfulness, but to say another few. Mindfulness, a heightened awareness in the present moment, non-judgmental form of awareness in the present moment. It's very vivid. Mindfulness is noticeable because it makes the experience more vivid. It helps the experience to come to life by its clarity. And for that reason, it's also associated with remembering to apply this kind of attention, but also once we've been mindful, that experience is much more easily remembered. And then having given up or having set down sadness and covetousness is how it's sometimes translated, or kind of, again, a kind of wanting, a desire, sadness and covetousness with regard to the world. And I would suggest that it's kind of like when you're doing this practice, it's kind of like what they say at the movies way back in the day before the COVID times when we could go to the movie theater and they would have these little public service announcements about just turn off your phone. It's not forever. It's just for this movie. So until you've reached the end of the path, you may not set down completely covetousness and sadness, domanassa, or yeah, pain. Truly, it's a kind of mental pain for the world, but you can, for some time, bring yourself to this practice and set those things aside. Set those things aside. And so, just to wrap up a few, again, just a very brief overview of the Satipatthana, and then we'll allow for some questions and comments, because I think many of you are familiar with it, but maybe be more interesting to have some dialogue. So the Buddha starts us off with those attributes, and then before even beginning with the first foundation of mindfulness, we began with mindfulness of the breath, mindfulness of the in and out breathing, just as we did in the meditation earlier. Finding the natural capacity for body and mind to settle on this ever-shifting breath, this ever-shifting flow of nourishment with the wind element. And then we go to mindfulness of body. Mindfulness of body, quite a few different practices in the mindfulness of body, mostly associated with two aspects, with really breaking some of the attachment to the body is beautiful, or relinquishing that in favor of a more realistic view of this bag of stuff. So starting with looking at anatomical parts and elements, the four elements: earth, air, fire, earth, water, fire, and air, usually in that order. And the death contemplations. There are other practices in there too. In the Pali, there's the movement, mindfulness in all sorts of different kinds of movement. I find that to be very helpful way of establishing mindfulness of body off the cushion, right? When you're walking, when you're standing, when you're lying down, eating, going to the bathroom. And then the death contemplations, one very simple one being related to the breath as well, right? This could be my last breath. Or even just acknowledging the end of the breath each time, the cessation and that pause in between each part of the breath. with a kind of not knowing whether that next part will actually come, a kind of curious openness. And then moving on to the feeling tones. So the feeling tones, very, very important part of the Satipatthana and also of many other teachings, the teachings on the five khandhas, the five aggregates, the teachings on dependent origination. Very important feeling tone, because it brings us to the study of the points of contact, the places where the body and the mind actually come into relationship and spark our conceptual experience, our cognitive experience. So it's a bridge in a way to the third satipatthana of mindfulness of mind. And I think I really appreciate Bhante Sujato uses this term, aspects of mind. That what we're studying in the third satipatthana are aspects of mind, because it helps to distinguish them from the fourth satipatthana, which is the Dhammas or principles. But knowing the attributes of mind itself, mind as a vast receptive field in which activity, mental activity, thoughts and feelings happen. So studying things like whether it's colored by delusion or whether it's scattered or whether it's composed or whether it's liberated. Temporary liberation in this case, because we haven't gotten actually to the awakening factors yet, which is part of the fourth satipatthana. So the two areas of mindfulness of dhammas are, so a way to look at mindfulness of dhammas is to think about patterns of thought that lead to further suffering or patterns of thought that lead to liberation, and frameworks that help with that. So for example, the six sense functions is in the Pali version, not in the Chinese agamas that I'm aware, but in the Pali version, I believe. And that can be, again, a very useful way of bridging the experience of mind with an understanding of how to skillfully attend to the experience, how to attend to the experience in a way that leads to knowing and seeing things as they truly are. So also included in the Dhammas are the five hindrances, as I mentioned earlier. So sense desire, ill will or aversion, sloth and torpor, restlessness and remorse, and doubt. And then the seven awakening factors. So joy, sati, of course, mindfulness, more mindfulness. The Buddha said in the very famous dictum of at the end of the sutta on dividing the seven, I think it was at the end of the sutta dividing the seven factors into 14. He says mindfulness is always useful. Oh no, it's dividing the factors into the those that are tranquilizing or calming, and those that are energizing. So sati is always useful, whether you need energizing or calming. But the energizing factors are the investigation of dhammas, energy, joy, and calming are the tranquility, the samadhi, or composure of mind. Immersion is the way that some people translate it. I appreciate that. Very true to the experience of it. And equanimity. So the Buddha says, he encourages us to come back again and again to these four aspects of experience. To become intimate with what seems already familiar. To know for ourselves this particular domain. And he reminds us that looking outward, looking to create a life which will always be pleasant, which will satisfy the senses, actually doesn't lead to that satisfaction. It doesn't lead to that sense of freedom and clarity that the four satipatthanas will bring. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and stop the recording at this point and open it up for some comments and questions. We have about maybe 20 minutes or so for that.